Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
You're watching or listening to the mother of all talk shows, the Open University of the Airwaves. No tuition fees, and you're positively encouraged to speak back to the teacher. Indeed, I'm not even qualified as a teacher. I left school at 16 to make tyres for Michelin. I can make a mean ZX radial, but I'm a facilitator, and basically I'm here in the chair so that you can hear alternative points of view and can contribute your own. So phone us or tweet us. Above all, spread the news. If you're watching on Facebook, share with all of your friends. I'm determined to get to the 1 million mark by Christmas. I told you that already. So, we're talking about China. Can we lose that drumbeat? I know that Ginger Baker has passed away, but there's no need for an interminable drumbeat. The first 30 seconds was quite enough. We'll talk about Ginger Baker later when I tell you I'm up to his part of the world in January. But just before the break, we were talking about the events in China, in Hong Kong in particular. I gave my point of view. My guest this evening will give hers, but that's not the final word. The final word can be yours. So make sure you hit the phones and the tweets. You can even Skype us, although fewer people are doing that than we anticipated. Thank you very much. By the way, this is not product placement. This is not Yorkshire Tea. Yorkshire Tea are not paying me to drink out of this mug. And as a matter of fact, I never drink Yorkshire Tea. This is Red Bush tea in a Yorkshire Tea mug. Let me take a sip before introducing my esteemed guest. She once travelled all the way from London to Gaza with me, and a very fine travelling companion she was. She's Joti Brar. She's a pro-China activist. She's one of Britain's leading communists. She writes and speaks. In fact, she's just brought her latest pamphlet to give me. She writes and speaks brilliantly. She's an admirable cadre of the Communist Party, but she is here to talk about China. Joti Brar, thanks very much for coming on the show. Do you think I summed up earlier what's really going on here? Except I'd add this caveat. It's quite clear that there's a sufficiently large number of people in Hong Kong alienated from the Chinese state and its leading force, the Communist Party of China, to sustain what is now quite a long period of attrition out on the streets, where it's getting really very dangerous and violent.
So I fully concur with your summary that you made earlier. I think what we have to be really clear about is that the leadership, the inspiration for this movement is not local. It's very, very clear that this guy, Joshua Wong, I feel a bit like with Juan Guaido, very forgettable guy, right? Who is he? He is not the inspiration for this. He is a front guy. He is a young man who was picked up as a 17-year-old student during the umbrella protests, which were also organised from outside. We see him everywhere, photographed with every enemy of the people, every friend of imperialism, every proxy for imperialism around them. He's been photographed with the white helmets. He's been photographed with Maidan coup people from the Ukraine. You know, he is friends with every one of Washington's coup plotters around the world. It's clear that the funding, the instruction, the arming, and the organisation for this movement is coming from outside. You know, USA has become very adept at setting up innocuous-sounding organisations. They used to do it directly through the CIA. It got embarrassing, they got exposed, they got caught with their hands dirty too many times. Now we have the National Endowment for Democracy. It sounds lovely. The reality is it's the CIA with a new name, and they perform the same functions. And it's very clear that Joshua Wong and the people like him are being trained by this CIA front to operate against China.
They call them NGOs, but in fact they are FGOs, foreign government organizations.
Exactly.
I was there once when Fidel Castro developed his thesis that NGOs were a Trojan horse sent in by the enemy to look nice, look nicer than the CIA would have looked. And that's true of these NGOs in Hong Kong also, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Oh, they perform an extremely insidious role. They are another wing of imperialism, performing, you know, the same functions with a different mask. And it's just a PR job, isn't it? Look at the white helmets. They're a PR front for a jihadi mercenary army. But it works very well when you have...
Well, you get an Oscar for it.
When you have the... Yeah, right. When you have the imperialist media who control so much of how we view the world, amplifying and endorsing and reinforcing the message of what these people are, it plays well. It's a script, and they all follow it, and there's no space on any of the airwaves for anybody who is willing and able to expose what's happening. So it's very difficult for ordinary people to understand that they're being fed a line, that it's basically a Hollywood script and it's a well-rehearsed playbook. You know, these colour revolutions that you talked about that earlier, they roll them out around the globe constantly. I mean, if we look right now, it's very early days. All the signs are they're trying to provoke a new one in Iraq right now.
Yeah, I spoke about that earlier. Let's stick to Hong Kong, though.
Yeah.
How serious a challenge is this to the central government in Beijing? The big day was, on the face of it, a great success. It was a very impressive ceremony in Tiananmen Square. But of course, the uprising of protest in Hong Kong was designed to rain on their parade, raining Molotov cocktails and every other kitchen sink that they could throw. Did it succeed in spoiling China? How serious a challenge is this to China?
Well, I don't think in China it succeeded in raining on the parade. Certainly, I'm sure people in China are concerned. I think the longer the protests go on, the less sympathy people in most of China, but even in Hong Kong,
have. So there's a lot of backlash in Hong Kong.
There's a big
now,
backlash. Yeah. But, you know, throughout most of China, there's increasing bewilderment at what these people think they're doing, and also how they've managed to develop such a split personality. I mean, they've been indoctrinated, and, you know, clearly British and US intelligence agencies have been at work for a while developing this idea of a kind of superiority of Hong Kong to the rest of China. Reality is that Hong Kong is falling behind the rest of China right now. You know, it makes much more sense for them to stick with China and go forward. This idea that by separating from China they'll do better is a total delusion. But nevertheless, these kids have been trained with some kind of superiority complex. Britain's very good. The imperialists are very good at creating little pockets of people who have privilege. Even
superior to some of the other ethnicities in Hong Kong itself.
I mean,
they parade a kind of racial supremacy, not just over Chinese people as a whole, but even some of their own neighbours in Hong Kong.
But, you know, as a Chinese reporter said to me recently, who do they think they are? The idea that they're racist against Chinese people, but who are they? That they can't understand that they're Chinese. You know, there is no such thing as a Hong Kong nationality. The idea of a Hong Kong national liberation movement is totally delusional. You know, Hong Kong was stolen from China by Britain at the point of a gun, as you've pointed out many times before, George. I don't need to tell it to you, but maybe, you know, repetition is the key to learning. People have to understand this. Hong Kong is China. It was stolen at gunpoint to be a base for pushing drugs on the Chinese people. It was finally and grudgingly returned by Britain in 1997. Britain's still acting as if it's got the right to dictate how Hong Kong should be run and preach to China about democracy in Hong Kong. I mean, anyone who knows anything about the history, it's kind of staggering.
Yeah, or the insouciance with which they talk about democracy in Hong Kong is extraordinary, given that we ruled it for 150 years without a scintilla of democracy, freedom, liberty of any kind.
Yeah, with nothing.
Now, let's talk about how China is handling it. On the face of it, although there's now been some kind of state of emergency, the Chinese state is handling it with kid gloves. Every Western journalist who wants to go there and embed themselves with the protesters is there. They say that China is a totalitarian dictatorship, but it's not acting like one in Hong Kong. Otherwise, all these agents would have been kicked out by now. All these television companies whose purpose is to cause a problem for China, not to report the news, because if it was to report the news, they'd all be in Paris, which has the benefit of being 27 miles away, as opposed to 6,266 miles away in Hong Kong. So they're there for other purposes, not to report on protests. China's allowing this. The People's Liberation Army has not been deployed. The Hong Kong police are handling matters, or not. And it's getting more and more violent. How long does China continue this approach? And do you think there's a discussion going on inside the Chinese government as to how long this can be permitted to continue in this way?
I mean, I'm sure there's a discussion going on, George, but one thing about the Chinese is they are nothing if not discreet. They don't tell you about the debates that they're having internally. And
they play the long game.
Nothing if not patient. They are exceptionally patient and thoughtful about what they do. They don't rush to act or rush to judge. They think things through. And they have shown incredible restraint, as you've said. I'm sure that they don't want to give any justification to the imperialists, any further fuel to their propaganda fire, to be able to go out and say, look, the evil dictatorship is crushing it. We told you it would. I mean, clearly this movement is a provocation. The idea is to prove that China is responding with force, to try and create, as you said earlier, you know, copycats elsewhere, to create a sense across China that the Liberation Army is an anti-people's army, not a pro-people's army, the sense that the state is an anti-people state, not a pro-people state, to try and encourage people anywhere else who might have any kind of discontent that now's a moment to rise up and, you know, fight.
Let's take a call, Joti,
sure.
From Wayne in Cheshire. Go ahead, Wayne.
It's always a pleasure, George.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
I've been watching the Hong Kong situation, and first of all, I've been on many demonstrations over 40 years myself in this country, in the UK, and first of all, I can't believe how these young people in Hong Kong think it's any better in the UK or America, which they're asking for help from. And if we demonstrated the way they do, oh my God, they would track us down, we'd be blacklisted, never get a job again, probably never get benefits, and be in prison for 10 years.
Well, that's a fair point, Joti, isn't it? That the demonstrators, if they behaved as they are behaving here in England, still more in France, they would be treated in a very different way to how, up till now at least, the Chinese state is treating them?
We see this in many countries where imperialism is inspiring and backing protest, that the governments have to be cautious in the way they respond, particularly because they don't want to encourage further attacks by imperialism, and they know what can happen with these provocations. They also have a different approach to these kind of protests because they are broadly pro-people governments. So they have the mass of the people on their side across China. Just it's similar to what you see in Venezuela, you know. They can afford to be a little more lenient, whether we would like to see them be a bit less so, a bit more firm in.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not advocating, you know, shooting people and so on. That would be dreadful. It would make every matter worse. But I'm not sure that you can stand by and allow your metro station to go up in flames. I mean, where next? They've sacked the parliament, they've burned down the metro station, they have made inoperable the airport, all of which are vital organs of the economy and society in Hong Kong.
Well, something that's interesting, I think, about what's been going on is that you see, as the protesters are given more leeway to go their length, they are alienating many sections of Hong Kong society who might previously have been a little or quite sympathetic to them. A lot of business people who worry about, you know, moving away from one country, two systems towards being just part of China in the normal way, which is due to happen in sort of 25 years' time, and would prefer to just stay fully capitalist and as autonomous as possible, and not really reintegrate with China. A lot of those people are seeing, this is not what we want. We can't operate this way. Look, they're killing business, they're killing the economy. You know, so in a way, and there's a school of thought that says by letting people run their length a little bit, they're alienating a lot of their
support. Yeah, I mean, that's what I thought they were doing for a time, but this has run quite a length. Last word from you, Wayne.
The main thing for me that stands out, that obviously Hong Kong has got a free press, they've got the internet and everything, so they seem to really truly believe that the UK and America is so much better and so much more freedom than they have at the moment. It amazes me.
Okay, Wayne from Cheshire, thanks very much for that call. Keep your calls coming in. Let's take a quick break.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
It is indeed the mother of all talk shows, and I'm talking with Joti Brar, a pro-China activist and one of the leading communists in Britain. Joti, finally, here's my take on this. Despite all the efforts, the British media and indeed the political class, which I think is quite divided on China, have not been able to demonize China in the way that they have demonized others. For example, you mentioned Venezuela, and indeed this situation is remarkably comparable to Venezuela. But others that I've, you know, seen and have come and gone. I'm even old enough to remember when Nasser was the new Hitler, and then it was one after the other. Despite their efforts, they haven't managed to make people in Britain hate China, hate the president of China. In fact, most people don't know the name of the president of China, and if they have seen it, they don't know how to pronounce it. So, in other words, the demonization of China has not really been successful. Now, one of the reasons, it seems to me, for that must be that everybody with two brain cells knows that China is doing rather well, that China has made more people prosperous, has taken more people out of poverty than any other system, state, party, government, regime in all of human history. And therefore, an attempt to persuade them that, you know, the Chinese government are the new Hitler hasn't worked, can't work. What do you think?
Well, there's two sides to it. One is we get a very divided view of China. So on the one hand, we're told they're responsible for the decline in our steel industry, although that started a long time before China was producing steel even. It's China's fault. That's a way to try and turn workers against China. On the other hand, we're told they've got evil, dictatorial, terrible, tyrannical government, and they're all oppressed and miserable. But then these other facts you were talking about, they leak out. China is the country that's doing the most to combat global warming, for example. On the one hand, we're told, oh, they're terrible polluters. On the other hand, we get news stories. I read yesterday in Forbes about how the world has become greener in the last 20 years because of China and India and their massive afforestation programs. You know, or we get information about China bringing so much solar energy online every day, that the only real place where climate change is being addressed meaningfully, actually, in the world is China. You know, and this kind of information comes out. China's the global leader in producing solar panels, that's making it a kind of viable technology for people everywhere, not just in China. You know, China's the one that's pushing forward in all types of recycling and green technologies. I saw someone, I was over there in February this year. They're really serious about it, you know. So we see, at the same time they're trying to push this terrible anti-China narrative, other things are coming through. Huawei. This whole thing with Huawei, they try and demonise Huawei and say, oh, it's a terrible, you know, breach of our security and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, you can't help noticing that China seems to be in charge of 5G, you know. Well, you don't get to do that without some serious investment in research and development and technology. And the fact that China's rising is clear.
Yeah, and isn't it also the case that Britain's ruling elite is divided about China because a lot of them would like to do business with China. A lot of them are doing business with China. George Osborne, David Cameron, they were famously pro-China voices in various debates. Even in the British cabinet of Theresa May, over the Huawei affair, the cabinet was divided as to whether to follow the American policy of shunning Huawei or at least partially try to incorporate it in 5G development.
There's a contradiction, isn't there? On the one hand, you know, business is business, and, you know, the ethos of business is to make money, and it doesn't really matter who you're making it with. On the other hand, as you know, global powers, China's rise is a threat to Britain's position. Britain is coming down, China's coming up, and, you know, one is at the expense of the other. That's how they see it. They want to retain their control, the imperialist US, Britain, of technology. They want to hold back China's development, but at the same time, there's plenty of British businesses who want to use China's technology. So there is a contradiction, definitely.
Now, just before you go, you brought me a pamphlet.
I did, yes.
Just let the viewers see it. It's The Drive to War Against Russia and China. Good title, good picture. And summarise it in 30 seconds.
It's really talking about why it is that Russia and China are targets of our imperialists. Why is it we're seeing this drive towards militarization and hostility towards Russia and China? And what should our attitude as British workers be towards that? What do we need to do to stop a war breaking out?
I've got another call. Not there yet. I did see today in the newspapers, funnily enough, in The Guardian, The Observer, for the first time, a gap in the Skripal narrative. It turns out that Trump told Theresa May that the US investigations and the US position was that Russia was not actually responsible for the attack on the Skripals. Now, we were never told this at the time, and of course it could be of considerable moment. I thought I had another caller for you, but I don't. And so, are you getting them up, Chris? Take about a minute. The reality is that Russia, the biggest European country, Moscow, the biggest European city, the Russian economy, despite all these sanctions, is doing really well. China, they talk about a fall in growth in China. It's a fall to a number that any other country would give their right arm to achieve. Here's finally, Ben in Manchester. Go ahead, Ben.
Hello, George. Good evening. How are you, mate?
Good evening to you. What would you like to say?
Yeah, George, just a quick one about Hong Kong and what's going on over there. Just a quick insert about the social credit system that China have got going on. Have you heard much about that?
I haven't, but Joti definitely will. What would you like to say about
excellent.
it? Yeah. Have you got...
yeah, so basically, I've read a bit about what China's doing with the social credit system. So it's like the government will read people's text messages, their shopping habits, what they talk about, and then they'll give people like a rating on it. And then that will dictate if they can get train tickets, plane tickets, what schools that their children can go to. It's quite authoritarian. So I've read a bit about it, and it's not looking too good. So I'd just like to get your guest's views on that, really, and how she feels that fits into...
I'm sure she will have a point of view on that. Joti?
Oh, my God. I hate to tell you this, George. I have no view. I've not looked into it at all.
Neither of us knows anything about this, Ben. Where are you reading
this?
I'd
recommend, George, you should definitely, if you get any time, definitely look into it.
Are you calling it social credit?
Social credit system, that's right, George.
All right, I'll look it up, Ben, and if I think it's worth it, I'll return to it maybe next week. Is that okay?
George, I think it's quite important. It's something that I don't feel Orwell could have dreamt up in his wildest imaginations. And
really?
As someone that believes in democracy and stuff, and freedom of speech, freedom of thought and expression.
Well, you wouldn't want to talk to me about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, would you, Ben? Because I've been hunted from the very few corners of the mainstream media that I once occupied because of my determination to freely speak and freely express my point of view. So I'm sure you're not saying that Britain, and even less so the United States, are themselves exemplars of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, are you?
Well, not necessarily, but I mean...
I heard a horse laughing outside. Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Well,
have you seen the newsstands? Have you looked at the front pages of all of Britain's newspapers? Have you watched Sky News, BBC News, Channel 4 News, ITV News? Have you watched Mar and Peston? It's one note, Ben. One solitary note.
Yeah. Well, I do know that in China that the journalists have to pass a test, and they can't be journalists unless they pass the government loyalty test.
What test do you think the journalists employed by Rupert Murdoch have to pass?
I've got no idea.
Well, I do, so let me tell you. I'll tell you what test they have to pass. The same test as Andrew Marr or Peston or Channel 4 News have to pass. They have to agree to keep their political coverage within the narrow parameters of the prevailing orthodox. And they have to agree to treat anyone outside those parameters as either mad or bad or both. So don't talk to me about journalists having to pass a test, because I could show you my scars, Ben. I can show you my sackings, Ben, for having a different point of view to the prevailing narrative. However, you have raised a point that neither of us could answer, and I promise you that we will return to that subject next week. Let's hear from Nate in the United States. Nate, welcome.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so you have your expert on, and a little bit of echo here, but I have been studying the Hong Kong protest.
Yeah.
And I've been taking on different perspectives and try to understand multiple sides. And I find it interesting that these Hong Kong protests erupted during a trade war, and the fact that China is so hands-off. And I guess my problem is I don't know how much authority is driven by Hong Kong government. I don't know what the influence of China's government in Beijing. I don't know what it's playing into, but it seems to me that it's incredibly hands-off. And I wonder if they've done a cost-benefit analysis that it's better not to engage in Hong Kong versus taking risks, maybe sanctions? I'm just curious about that angle.
Yeah, no, it's a very good call, Nate, and a very interesting point that you make. As I think Joti implied, at least earlier, Hong Kong is actually much less important to China now than it was when in 1997 at the time of the handover. Other places in China are booming much more than Hong Kong. Hong Kong's economic future actually now looks bleaker than many other parts of China. And instead of asking China to help them catch up, you've got a group of people backed by foreign interest who are doing their best to disrupt and weaken further the Hong Kong economy. But Joti, Nate's point is that one of the reasons why China is not cracking down on this now, I don't know how many weeks, must be 20 odd weeks, not doing so because of the trade wars, because a trade deal with the United States may even yet, despite all the static in the atmosphere, within reach. Certainly Donald Trump could do with it in the run-up to the presidential election. Do you think that may be one of the things that is present in the debate we've both agreed must be taking place inside the Chinese leadership?
There's no doubt that the trade discussions and negotiations are going on in the background all the time, whether or not they're in the headlines. There's also no doubt that the disruption, the pressure that's coming to China via Hong Kong will be being used by the states as a piece in their game to try and, you know, it's a classic technique. And certainly Trump likes this kind of bargaining, right? All or nothing, you know, like he promised fire and fury to Korea and then the next day he's having a burger or whatever. So they will be using this as a pressure point, and it will be one of the reasons that China doesn't want to be gung-ho in its response.
Interesting. Nate, thanks very much indeed for that call. So I'm going to digest your latest pamphlet, The Drive to War Against Russia and China, and I'll report back on how it is. But having read Joti's work, having spoken with her, having travelled with her, I'm greatly impressed. I hope you were too. Joti Brar, thanks very much for joining us on the Mother of All Talkshows.
Thank you.